Long, medium, and short. All beautiful, all blonde. Get the perfect woman look.
If you weren't born with it, you can buy a couple ornaments. Just be sure to read the warning, kids, 'cause pretty soon you'll be bored of it. Ha ha, sexual. Hey girl, if you wanna feel sexual, you can always call up a professional. They stick pins in you like a vegetable. Ha ha, kids forever, kids forever. Baby soft skin turns into leather. Don't be dramatic, it's only some plastic. No one will love you if you're unattractive. Oh, Mrs. Potato Head, tell me, is it true that pain is beauty? Does a new face come with a warranty? Will a pretty face make it better? Oh, Mr. Potato Head, tell me, how did you afford a surgery? Do you swear you'll stay forever, even if her face don't stay together? Even if her face don't stay together. If you want a little more confidence, potatoes turn to french fries, yeah, it's common sense. All you need's a couple more condiments and $100,000 for some compliments. Ha ha, it's such a waste when little girls grow into their mother's face. But little girls are learning how to cut and paste and pucker up their lips until they suffocate. Ha ha, kids forever, kids forever. Baby soft skin turns into leather. Don't be dramatic, it's only some plastic. No one will love you if you're unattractive. Oh, Mrs. Potato Head, tell me, is it true that pain is beauty? Does a new face come with a warranty? Will a pretty face make it better? Oh, Mr. Potato Head, tell me, how did you afford a surgery? Do you swear you'll stay forever, even if her face don't stay together? Stay forever, stay forever, even if her face don't stay together. Stay forever, stay forever, even if her face don't stay together. Oh, Mrs. Potato Head, tell me, is it true that pain is beauty? Does a new face come with a warranty? Will a pretty face make it better? Oh, Mr. Potato Head, tell me, how did you afford a surgery? Do you swear you'll stay forever, even if her face don't stay together? Stay forever, stay forever, even if her face don't stay together. Stay forever,
two elderly West Virginians were driving along Route 250 in Wetzel County, they spot what appears to be a mannequin. But to make sure it isn't a real human, they stop to get a closer look. What they uncover isn't a mannequin, but indeed what they initially feared. There, lying in the snow, is the naked body of a white female. After authorities arrive, investigators learn that the body has been recently placed in the location of its discovery, and they presume that she died 2 days prior, at a different location. Police have two reasons to believe this. Firstly, snow is present on the ground but not on her corpse. This suggests that she hasn't been there for very long. Secondly, tire tracks and footprints are visible in the snow leading away from the body. Her cause of death is never fully determined by authorities, although they believe she was likely strangled or suffocated. In addition, nothing indicates that she was sexually assaulted. The woman's age is believed to be between 35 and 45 years old. Prior to her death, she was well-groomed and her hair was auburn in color. This particular detail will soon become important to detectives. A female with strawberry blonde hair is found lying beside Interstate 40 near West Memphis, Arkansas. She has been strangled to death and only a sweater remains on her lifeless body. Authorities believe the woman was murdered after leaving a truck stop, possibly hitchhiking. The investigation ensues, but she is not identified until nearly a year later, when a couple from Florida, whom the victim lived with temporarily, recognizes her in June of the following year. The victim is identified as 28-year-old Lisa Nichols. As investigators dig deeper into her past, they learn something troubling. Lisa was at odds with her family, and this inevitably led to her remaining unidentified for 9 months. On New Year's Day, a rapidly decomposing corpse is discovered, this time along Interstate 75 near Jellicoe, Tennessee, in Campbell County. She is fully clothed with jeans, a shirt, and a tan pullover. Freckles and burn marks are observable on the woman's body, but interestingly enough, she also has short, red hair, similar to the previous victims. Indeed, at this point, it seems less of a coincidence to authorities. The unidentified woman is between the ages of 17 and 25, although some believe she's 30 years old. After an autopsy report, investigators find out that she was 2 to 5 months pregnant when she was murdered. The method used to kill her remains undisclosed. Along the side of Route 78 in DeSoto County, Mississippi, yet again the body of a woman is discovered. She wears a pinkish-orange pullover and jeans. The victim's shoes are missing. It's likely the killer took them as a trophy. On the woman's ankles are the tattoos of the initials THC and REJ, or RET. Her hair is reddish to strawberry blonde. Police soon determine that the cause of her death was strangulation, and she might have also been sexually assaulted. An autopsy reveals that she smoked regularly and had a habit of biting her nails. Police believe she is connected to the other murders due to her hair color. In Pleasant View, Cheatham County, Tennessee, The skeletal remains of a white female with red hair are found on the side of Interstate 24. She is fully clothed, wearing pants, a shirt, a sweater, and underwear. Due to the color of her hair, investigators firmly believe her death was related to the other murders. An autopsy report shows that she was between the ages of 31 and 40 years old during the time of her death. Along Route 25 in Knox County, Kentucky, a young white female's body is discovered in an old white Admiral refrigerator, likely from the 1950s, with a decal of words spelling Superwoman. The victim's body is almost entirely nude. She wore yellow and green striped socks on her feet. She's believed to be 24 to 35 years old. The woman's cause of death is suffocation, and police determine she has been dead for a few days. Reports soon surface that the victim may have been searching for a ride over CB radio so she could reach South Carolina. However, this has not been confirmed. Regrettably, she isn't able to be identified by authorities, but despite this, over 500 people heartwarmingly attend her funeral. A second victim is uncovered in Campbell County. However, this time the body is quite a distance from Interstate 75. Furthermore, unlike the other victims, she is very young, between the ages of 9 and 15. The girl's body is found near a strip mine when someone happens to stumble upon it, 400 yards from Big Wheel Gap Road. Unfortunately, the girl's remains are partial. Only her skull and 31 other bones are recovered. Although authorities can't determine her cause of death, police are certain it was likely a homicide. However, they aren't certain whether or not she can be entirely linked to the Redhead murders, since they're unable to determine the color of her hair. Nevertheless, she's still considered a victim of the same killer. Again, another murder takes place in Tennessee. The body of an unidentified woman with brownish blonde hair and red highlights is discovered in Greene County. Severe blunt force trauma and a possible stab wound are the cause of her death. The woman was 6 to 8 weeks pregnant, but miscarried before being murdered. Authorities say she was 14 to 20 years old at the time of her death. Notably, she has fillings in her teeth, which indicate that she was cared for at some point during her life. Near the state border of Alabama at Rising Fawn, Dade County, Georgia, the body of a woman with red hair is discovered. She wears jeans, a dark blue pullover shirt, and black shoes. In addition to this, she wears 2 pieces of jewelry, a golden necklace and ring with a heart-shaped pattern. Investigators soon learn that the victim has been strangled to death and sexually assaulted. It is likely that the woman was a runaway or hitchhiker. There are several other deaths that could be potentially linked to the Redhead murders. These include other bodies that were found in Arkansas, Missouri, Tennessee, Ohio, Texas, and North Carolina. However, there are many inconsistencies that don't match with the known victims of the Redhead murders. Two suspects come up during the investigation. One is a 37-year-old truck driver who attacked and attempted to strangle a woman with reddish hair. The second suspect is a 32-year-old trucker in Pennsylvania who is being interrogated after kidnapping and raping a young woman in the state of Indiana. However, both suspects are dismissed, and unfortunately, investigators find no other leads in the case, and the killer is still at large. If you have any information that could resolve the case of the Redhead murders, please contact the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation at 1-800-824. The ocean, one of the most beautiful and mysterious, as well as one of the scariest places a person can go. If something scary or unexplained has happened to you, submit it to submitscarystories@gmail.com to possibly be featured in an upcoming episode of Seriously Strange. A group of divers were embarking on a deep dive 200 feet below to see a sunken German U-boat. The man who recalls this traumatic event, an experienced diver, knew well the dangers of deep dives and the importance of decompression. He began to ascend towards the surface slowly after about 10 minutes of swimming around the old U-boat in order to minimize decompression. Ascending too quickly without acclimating when diving as far as they had been can result in a number of horrible things, such as a loss of consciousness and even death. Another couple that had also been diving, a father and his young son, still weren't coming back up as minutes continued to tick by. After 50 minutes went by and the father and son still weren't ascending, the captain of the diving boat sent the more experienced diver back down into the water to see if he could find the missing two. And he did find them, still at the U-boat, but in a deadly situation. The son had been trapped under a piece of metal, and his father was desperately trying to get his son free, frantic as any father would be. Spotting the danger and knowing that time was of the essence, he approached the two as quickly as possible and helped to get the boy free. But the diver noticed that the father and son were far from relieved. They were running out of air, and they were panicking. Their bodies, flooded with nitrogen, would not be able to handle a quick swim to the surface, but it was looking like that's where their thoughts were. The diver did everything he could to keep the two safe. Considering their air had become dangerously low, he shared his oxygen with them both while trying to keep them calm for their gradual ascent. But the moment that the son saw an opportunity, he bolted for the surface. Instinctively, the father took off after him. Knowing what would occur if they reached the surface too quickly, the diver reached out and managed to grab a hold of the father and tried to keep him down. But he broke free in a frenzy to reach his son. Nothing more could be done. The diver ascended behind them safely, but the moment he broke the surface, he knew something was very, very wrong. By the time the father and son were pulled onto the boat, the father was entirely unresponsive. The son was still alive, but struggling tremendously. The Coast Guard was called in by helicopter to help, but by the time they arrived, the father was already dead and too far gone to have a chance at being revived. His son, however, was still battling for his life. They got him onto the chopper, and the captain said they should leave immediately to save the son's life, as he didn't have much time left. But the Coast Guard demanded they also take the father's body on board, against the captain's advice. It took precious time to get the father's dead body into the chopper, as he was dead weight, and the surface of the water was very choppy, swaying the boat considerably back and forth. By the time the chopper got the father on board and proceeded to work on saving his son's life, the son had tragically died. It was a scarring moment that the diver will never forget. Despite his best efforts, fear had claimed the lives of 2 people that day. You never know when you dive beneath the surface of the water if you might just solve a mystery. A surfer had been missing for a few days, and despite efforts to find him, they turned up nothing. And getting lost in the ocean can lead to an endless hunt that could very well provide no results and no closure. But a group of friends who decided to go diving came face to face with the conclusion that everyone would dread. The friends were excited to dive in and explore whatever lurked in the waters. Among all the incredible things they witnessed, one thing stood out. Something that appeared to be a human body, and unfortunately for them, it was. The surfer who had been missing for a number of days had now just been found, but it wasn't merely just a body floating beneath the waves that disturbed them. It was the condition the body was in. It seemed like some of the ocean life had made a meal of the body. But it wasn't merely chewed at. The surfer had been wearing a wetsuit that left his arms, legs, and head exposed. It's unknown how he died exactly, but once he had spent enough time underwater and began to decompose, it attracted what was assumed to be crabs. Every bit of exposed flesh had been torn away, and the muscle beneath it as well. In only a matter of days, the exposed parts of the surfer's body had been stripped clean, so the divers encountered a torso with skeletal arms and legs and an exposed skull. Horrified, the team of friends promptly returned to the surface. Needless to say, the diving trip came to a rather abrupt end, and the surfers' loved ones found a rather morbid sense of closure. A diver tells a haunting story while going on a night dive with 2 of his close friends. While hunting prawns, the divers all hovered at around 100 feet deep. It was about 1 in the morning and the water was especially cold. Without lights, it was absolutely pitch black, a blackness so dark that it could really only be witnessed in the ocean. The friends had a certain practice that they would do when going out on night dives. The 3 of them would all get in a circle and turn off their lights, leaving themselves in utter darkness. They'd then stir up the water and watch as bioluminescent organisms glowed around them in a scene of absolute splendor. It felt like floating among the stars in the night sky. But an eerie surprise was lurking in that darkness, just waiting to be illuminated. The bioluminescence was just bright enough for each friend to see each other. The 3 divers all looked at one another, but they soon realized there was a 4th diver with them, sitting in their circle. Immediately, thoughts began running through their minds. Seeing other divers wasn't uncommon, but at 1 a.m. it was strange. Even stranger, they saw no one prepping at the dock above that divers used. They stared silently at the newcomer who didn't move. They noticed he had no gloves or fins on, yet he seemed to swim effortlessly to their location. The friends all wore dry suits because of how cold the water was, but this mysterious diver wore a wetsuit with exposed skin. The 3 friends also noticed a very large gash on one of the man's legs. They were speechless and far too scared to even make a move. That's when the man clearly smiled at them, waved, and then swam away, unhindered by the freezing temperatures, leaving them all terrified and unable to ever explain what exactly had happened. There was never any sign of another diver in the water, certainly none with such little equipment, somehow untouched by the harsh element of the cold. It was an unforgettable encounter that never accompanied an explanation. That's all for now. Remember, you may not believe it, but anything is possible in a world. Parents would like to believe that the shows they allow their children to watch are wholesome and innocent. However, this might not always be the case. From subtle adult jokes to obvious obscenities, today we count down 5 of the most inappropriate children's shows to air on television. On July 8, 2007, Total Drama Island, a parody of the reality show Survivor, premiered in Canada on Teletoon. Then, on June 5, 2008, the show first aired in the United States on Cartoon Network. A portion of Total Drama Island's original content was removed in order to retain a PG rating. Some of the expunged content included long beeps to suggest that the reality show was censoring profanities spoken by the characters. Even so, the type of content in the show was still rare for Cartoon Network at the time. It was the 3rd show on the channel outside of Adult Swim and Toonami to have a TV PG rating. But despite its initial content being trimmed down and a parental guidance warning at the beginning of each episode, Total Drama Island had many episodes that some believe were pushing the envelope. For instance, many of the scantily dressed female characters frequently made out with male characters. In addition to this, there were more than a few instances insinuating that some of the characters were going off to have sex. The show is also littered with other adult jokes and innuendos. Although Total Drama Island was frowned upon by many parents, this did not stop the creators from making it into a series, Total Drama, with 5 seasons so far. A new show in the series, Total Drama Daycare, is currently scheduled to be released sometime in 2018. A show notorious for its extremely bizarre and disturbing antagonists, Courage the Cowardly Dog was a horror comedy about a dog who continually encountered monsters, aliens, and demons with his elderly owners in the middle of nowhere. It first aired on Cartoon Network in 1996 as an animated short featured in Hanna-Barbera's What a Cartoon. The animated short, The Chicken from Outer Space, eventually became what is now known as Courage the Cowardly Dog, after it was greenlit by Cartoon Network. Its first episode aired on November 12, 1999. Many can recall the nightmarish and perturbing villains who terrorized Courage and his family throughout the show. Whether it was simply the appearance of the monster or the grim insinuations, Courage the Cowardly Dog easily frightened many of the children who grew up watching it. Some of the dark implications of the show included cannibalism, severe psychological agitation, the creation of marionettes out of human corpses, and possibly even prostitution. But even more unsettling was the grotesque and unnatural CGI animation used to create some of the monsters in the show. 4 seasons of Courage the Cowardly Dog were produced, with the final episode airing on November 22nd of 2002. Over the years, it has gained a cult following. Without doubt, the haunting memories of this show are still well and alive in the minds of those who grew up watching it.
Freedom has nothing to do with age.
Betty Boop is an iconic animated cartoon character who has appeared in television shows on many different occasions, including Talkertoon and a Betty Boop film series. Despite seeming innocent at first glance, upon closer inspection one will realize that there is something rather adult about this golden age cartoon idol. What many do not realize is that Betty Boop was an exaggerated depiction of what many call a jazz-age flapper, a young Western woman from the 1920s who rebelled against the social norms of the era, such as wearing excessive amounts of makeup, smoking, treating sex casually, and drinking. An example of this can be observed in the Talkertoons Minnie the Moocher, where Betty's character was portrayed as a teenage girl who went against the wishes of her more traditional parents by running away from home with her boyfriend. In other cartoons featuring Betty Boop, there are many male characters who attempt to slyly peek at her when she's either changing or minding her own business. In one particular cartoon entitled Chestnuts, a character named the Black King intrudes into her house and ties her up. When she rejects him, the Black King drags her to a bedroom and says to her, "I will have you." And then the bed runs away, suggesting that the Black King intended on raping Betty. In another cartoon called Boop Oop a Doop, Betty is a performer at a circus. In the episode, an evil ringmaster can be seen lusting after her, singing the song, "Do Something." After presenting these illustrations, it is safe to conclude that Betty Boop was indeed more than just a harmless cartoon character, and perhaps should have been content more appropriate for adults. The Animaniacs was an animated comedy television series that first aired on Fox Kids from 1993 to 1995. It soon after appeared on the WB from 1995 to 1998. The show consists of skits featuring three main characters, the Warner siblings, as well as a wide range of other characters. Throughout the series, the Animaniac characters interact with famous people, figures of history, and even mythological beings. But despite this innocuous synopsis of the show, there have been many times where the show contained sexual references and adult humor. Examples include one episode where Yakko mistakes the word conjugate for consummate, many instances where Yakko and Wakko gawk at attractive women walking by, and even a scene where it was insinuated that a cartoon Madonna went off to have sex with two men. One of the more well-known scenes involved Yakko, Wakko, and Dot playing detective. Yakko tells Dot to dust for Prince, and after some time she says that she found Prince, but it wasn't exactly what we might have been expecting.
I found Prince! No, fingerprints. I don't think so.
Children watching the show probably never understood the adult innuendos, but it is certainly shocking to look back at the series and realize just how many there were. The Ren and Stimpy Show is an animated series that first premiered on August 11th of 1991 as one of the 3 original Nicktoons on Nickelodeon. The series is about a psychologically unstable chihuahua named Ren and Stimpy, a loving cat with a very low intelligence. Although the premise of the show doesn't really seem so horrible, the Ren and Stimpy Show is a series filled with adult jokes, sexual insinuations, dark humor, and violence. Many of the episodes contain scenes that include Ren pulling bloody nerves out of his rotten gums, a jester using a cheese grater to shred his skin off and applying a lemon to his cut arm, a family bath where Ren and Stimpy join their owners naked in a bathtub, Ren being scraped violently against face stubble, Ren eating cat litter, and many other revolting scenes. Numerous episodes were banned and censored by Nickelodeon for containing graphic violence, religious jokes, a scene of the Twin Towers being destroyed, as well as other dark subject matter. After 52 episodes and 5 seasons on December 16, 1995, the show ended. However, in 2003, an adult spin-off series entitled Ren and Stimpy Adult Party Cartoon aired on Spike, but was soon cancelled after its debut. Many parents are relieved that this insane and at times repulsive show is no longer aired on children's television, and Paramount Pictures rejected the idea of rebooting the series. That's all for now. Let me know in the comments what your favorite cartoon was growing up. I think most of us made it to adult. Many of us have childhood memories that bring us a sense of nostalgia. Or maybe you remember the fairy tales, songs, or stories read at bedtime. But some of those stories are far less innocent than we remember, or have rather heinous origins. The nursery rhyme Three Blind Mice at face value seems like an ordinary, innocent tune, but some historians draw parallels between the rhyme and events that occurred during Queen Mary I of England's rule from 1553 to 1558. An adamant Roman Catholic, she executed around 300 Protestant people, earning herself the title of Bloody Mary. It's speculated that 3 particular victims, Protestant loyalists who were burned at the stake, are the subjects of the popular nursery rhyme. The 3 men were accused of plotting to assassinate the queen, mirrored by the line of the song, "They all ran after the farmer's wife. She cut off their tails with a carving knife." The queen's husband, King Philip, owned many estates, including farmland, and the queen took her revenge by cutting off their tails, burning the men at the stake. This is only one of many nursery rhymes children sing, unaware of the word's darker meaning. Following the release of the 1961 animated film 101 Dalmatians, demand for Dalmatian puppies drastically increased by up to 30%. But Dalmatians were not all that their adopters expected them to be. Often bought as presents for children who were fans of the movie, parents neglected to research the personalities and training requirements of the breed. Dalmatians can be stubborn and even aggressive if not trained properly, and can be particularly impatient with children, nipping at them. Many parents, disgruntled with their new dog's feisty nature and upkeep, who had expected them to be laid back, put the dogs back up for adoption. Unfortunately, many of the dogs were likely put into shelters or abandoned, or even put to sleep as an indirect result of the movie's popularity. The doe-eyed, well-intended Pinocchio of the 1940 Disney film is innocent compared to the original doll. The basic story remains the same. Pinocchio, a puppet created by a man named Geppetto, wants to become a real boy. But in the original story, Jiminy Cricket and Pinocchio are far from friends. After Jiminy tells Pinocchio to go home, the puppet is filled with rage at being bossed around, and he crushes Jiminy with a heavy hammer, killing him. After he tells Geppetto that it was all the cricket's fault and that he did not want to kill him, karma catches up with Pinocchio when he later burns his feet off by resting them on a stove. Pinocchio then hears that by planting gold coins, a gold tree will grow. The spirit of Jiminy Cricket warns Pinocchio not to bury the coins, but the puppet doesn't listen. Nearby townspeople catch the puppet in the act and accuse him of hiding gold, for which they hang him. In the story, Pinocchio survives despite being hanged, but even so, the original version shows a far more violent underbelly to a well-known children's movie, reminding us that Disney isn't all fun and games. The word glee conjures feelings of happiness, or makes one think of the popular musical show that ran from 2009 to 2015, but one member of the cast was anything but cheerful. Mark Salling, who portrays the popular Noah Puckerman on the show, was arrested in 2015 for a large stash of child pornography. Over 100,000 images and videos were discovered from his laptop, USB flash drive, and hard drive. Salling has pled not guilty, and the final hearing has been repeatedly delayed, reportedly because he wants to settle the case out of court. Radar Online reported that the next court hearing will take place on May 30th, 2017. Charles Dickens, renowned author of the family classic A Christmas Carol, grew up in an environment of poverty and darkness. His entire family, with the exception of one sister, were imprisoned. Much like the children in his stories, he lived in a rat-infested house and was abused and neglected, which influenced the somber tone in his writing. What so few people know is the influence this had on his personality. Quick-tempered, Dickens often neglected and even physically abused his wife and gave his children little attention, despite the fact he had 10 of them. Dickens was so unhappy in his marriage, he began dating a 19-year-old woman at the age of 45, writing a letter to his actual wife accusing her of mental instability. The letter was later released to the public so all could see that not all of Charles Dickens' writing was based purely in fiction. Lewis Carroll, author of the children's books such as Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, had a dark and chaotic past. While there is still some contention regarding the truth of this case, a BBC documentary released in 2015 claimed Lewis was repressing a dark urge. The character Alice was based off of the author's neighbor's daughter, Alice Liddell. The documentary alleges that researchers found a photo of Alice's older sister completely nude in an inappropriate, suggestive pose, looking rather uncomfortable. The photo was found in a museum with an inscription reading, "Property of Lewis Carroll and Lorena Liddell," taken at a time when the age of consent was just 12 years old. Vanessa Tate, the great-granddaughter of Alice Liddell, said she believed that Lewis was in love with Alice and that anyone who said he wasn't a strange man was simply wrong. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland is perceived to be a children's tale, but through the eyes of its author may be something much more twisted. Italian poet Giambattista Basile wrote the original story of Sleeping Beauty, and it is a much darker tale than the Disney version many are familiar with. The very beginning foretells a prophecy that the king's daughter, Thalia, will prick her finger on a splinter of flax or hemp. In place of Maleficent, an old woman spins the thread that Thalia pricks her finger on. When Thalia does not wake, the distraught king locks her up forever. One day, a passing hunter uncovers her and sexually violates her in her sleep. Thalia gives birth to his child while still in a comatose state, only waking when the child sucks on her finger. She falls in love with the hunter who impregnated her, only to find out he's married, and his wife is reasonably distraught. In revenge, the wife orders the chef to cook up Thalia's child and serve it to them at supper. Thinking the baby is dead, she reveals her plot to the king, but the chef didn't follow through with the order, thankfully. The king burnt the wife alive, and a twisted happily ever after followed. The story of The Little Mermaid has been popularized by Disney through its 1989 animated adaptation. The original story by Hans Christian Andersen was not the happily ever after version that many know and love. In the original story, the Little Mermaid falls in love with a handsome prince above the water. After a storm hits and she saves his life by leaving him in the care of women at a temple, she makes a dark deal with the Sea Witch. For sacrificing her beautiful voice, she will gain legs that feel like walking on knives, but she will be a dancer that surpasses any other human. If the prince falls in love and marries her by dawn, she will gain a soul and can be with him, but if he doesn't, she will turn into sea foam. She agrees to the terms and seeks out the prince, who wants to marry the woman who saved him. Without her voice, the mermaid cannot tell the prince it was her, so he marries a woman from the temple. The little mermaid is offered one last chance to live. She must kill the prince with a knife from the sea witch. Even upon seeing the prince sleeping with his bride, she cannot bring herself to kill him, and she flings herself into the sea, turning into foam. One of the saddest stories here is that of Judith Barsi, a young budding actress and the voice of Ducky in the animated film The Land Before Time. Although she was born in America, her family was Hungarian. Her father, Joseph, had a history of mental and physical abuse, threatened to kill himself, and was arrested 3 times for drunk driving. Once, Judith told a friend that he threw pots and pans at her, resulting in a nosebleed. Joseph also threatened to slit Judith and her mother's throat and burn down their house. The stress from home life was so overwhelming, Judith pulled out all of her eyelashes. But things took a turn for the worst on the evening of July 15, 1988. Joseph shot Judith in the head while she was asleep, ending both her flourishing acting career and her life permanently. After killing his wife, he poured gasoline on the bodies and lit them on fire, went to the garage, and shot himself in the head. The promising future of a young budding actress snuffed out by the man meant to protect her. The world knew him as Dr. Seuss, but the man behind the pen name, Theodore Seuss Geisel, was anything but a pure soul. Theodore's first wife, Helen Palmer, also a children's author, suffered several severe illnesses over 13 years, including cancer. Instead of being by her side, Theodore was sleeping with Helen's friend Audrey Stone Diamond. When Helen found out, she penned a suicide letter to her husband. "I feel myself in a spiral going down, 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 into a black hole from which there is no escape, no brightness. I love you so much. I am too old and enmeshed in everything you do and are that I cannot conceive of life without you. My going will leave quite a rumor, but you can say I was overworked and overwrought. Your reputation with your friends and fans will not be harmed." Helen committed suicide in 1957, thinking of Theodore and his reputation, despite the pain he'd caused her. Audrey and Dr. Seuss continued their relationship and later married, until Dr. Seuss's passing in 1991. That's all for now. If you'd like to fight to keep creepy content on YouTube, consider giving even $1 to my Patreon, linked in the description below. With your help, we can keep YouTube creepy. Thanks for listening. Now be sure to check women, delicate, flighty, and driven by emotion, some men might say, but be careful about that, because it just might be the last thing you ever say. Delphine LaLaurie was a wealthy Southern socialite in the 1800s, and she was an infamous slave owner. Delphine had been married 3 times and given birth to multiple children. On her 3rd marriage, she had inherited not only a new, beautiful home, but all of the slaves that came with it. In 1832, she had built her own mansion on Royal Street in New Orleans. It was large, having 3 stories and attached housing for her slaves. but one room in the uppermost area of the mansion was kept a dark secret. Delphine didn't simply enjoy having her slaves around to perform hard labor, she had much more sinister desires for them. She ran a tight ship and was not above punishing her slaves for even minor indiscretions. Delphine had a young girl, a daughter of one of her slaves, comb her hair. When the girl hit a snag, Delphine promptly took up a whip and began violently lashing the girl. The assault was so severe that the girl ran to the roof and jumped off to her death. She attempted to cover the death up, but police eventually found the girl's body hidden in a well. Delphine was fined and forced to sell all of her slaves. Though she was as cunning as she was wicked, she secretly arranged for friends and relatives to purchase her slaves and afterwards snuck them back into her estate. Delphine's children would, at times, feel compassion for the slaves. If her children offered any of the slaves food, however, they would be severely beaten. Madame Delphine's sinister ways knew no bounds. When a slave had maybe made a mistake or slipped up in any way, she was sure that they would be punished in ways unimaginable. Police didn't really feel too much of a need to investigate, as mistreating slaves wasn't exactly a crime. However, one day, Delphine's mansion caught fire. Police and fire marshals rushed to put the fire out and found a 70-year-old black slave woman who worked as the cook, chained to the stove. The woman was still alive and claimed to authorities that she was the one who started the fire in an attempt to kill herself. She told them that she was trying to avoid punishment. She didn't want to be taken to the uppermost room of the mansion because so many slaves had gone there and never returned. Bystanders who had responded to the fire forced themselves into the uppermost room to be sure everyone was evacuated, but they ended up stepping into a nightmare. Slaves strung up by chains, still alive, suffered beyond measure. Some of them had amputated limbs, some had their limbs stretched out until they tore, some had their mouths sewn shut. These were only a few of the things. Authorities had dug up the yard and found human remains, one of which belonged to a young child. An enraged public stormed Delphine's mansion and tore down everything they could. The building was pretty much an empty shell when they were done. She was forced out of the country and fled to Paris to avoid persecution, where she lived out the rest of her days. The first woman in Australia to be sentenced to life in prison without parole? Yes, that would be Katherine Knight. Katherine lived an unfortunate life growing up. She was the victim of much sexual abuse from family members until she was around 11 years old. She grew attached to her uncle, who had been the only person to show her kindness, until he committed suicide in 1969 when she was only 14 years old. She was devastated by the loss and claimed that his ghost would often visit her. Katherine was a girl destroyed by her past. Overall described as a pleasant person, she would often break into murderous rages. Those fits would tend to come to surface over the most minor of incidents, and as she grew older, they came more and more often. By the age of 16, she was working at what she referred to as her dream job. She would cut meats for a local slaughterhouse. Eventually, she was promoted and given her own set of butcher's knives, which she hung up everywhere she ever lived, in case she ever needed them. Eventually, of course, Katherine would come to find love in her first husband, David Kellett. But not even love could subside Katherine's unstoppable rage. Even on their wedding night, Katherine attempted to strangle David. Her reason? He fell asleep after only 3 rounds of sex. David was a drunk and often liked to spend his time drinking at the bar, and Katherine was okay with this, but only if he was at home by a certain time. One night, however, David wasn't home in time. He had stayed out late playing darts with his friends, and upon his arrival home, Katherine, pregnant with his child, clubbed him over the head with a frying pan after burning all of his clothes. David scrambled to escape and managed to get to a neighbor's house before he collapsed. it was revealed that Catherine had hit him so hard she fractured his skull. The police wanted to charge Catherine, but by then Catherine had been on her best behavior and convinced David to drop the charges. They even continued their on-again, off-again relationship until Catherine eventually left in 1984. But don't you worry, she was yet again to find love. She met David Saunders in 1986, and amidst a terrible relationship, she slit the throat of his 2-month-old puppy simply to show him what would happen to him if he ever decided to have an affair. She then, in proper fashion, clubbed him over the head with a frying pan. Her new husband, much like the last, just didn't know when to throw in the towel. Eventually, she slammed him across the face with an iron and stabbed him in the chest, and that's when he called it quits. John Price came into the picture a few years later, and Catherine yet again felt the familiar warmth of love. John was a man loved by the community, with little negative to be said about him. In 1998, Catherine pushed for John to marry her. Despite the occasional violent outbreak, their relationship was a stable one. John's children liked Catherine, he made good money at his job, but John didn't want to marry Catherine just yet, and in retaliation, she videotaped items that John had stolen from his job and sent the tape to his boss. Though the items were outdated medical kits taken from the garbage, he was fired from the job he had held for 17 years. That very day, John had kicked Catherine out of the house, but they didn't remain separated for very long. A few months later, he welcomed her back. However, she wasn't allowed to live with him this time. The violent outbursts continued, and Catherine ended up stabbing John in the chest in 2000. That was apparently the final straw, and he broke off the relationship. He took a trip to the courthouse and had a restraining order put in place to keep Catherine away from him and his children. That very afternoon, John told his co-workers that if he didn't arrive for work the next day, it was because Catherine had killed him. Though they pleaded with him not to return home, he felt that if he did not, Catherine would kill his children instead. Surprisingly enough, a piece of paper wasn't enough to keep Catherine at bay. When John eventually returned home, he realized that his children had been sent to stay at a friend's house by Catherine. Catherine did come to John's house that night as he slept. At some point in the night, she took one of her knives and stabbed him in the chest. John snapped awake and struggled to get away, trailing blood throughout the house, but he couldn't escape. He bled out just shy of the front door. Death, however, was not enough for Catherine. She went on to commit an atrocity that made all of Australia tremble. John had been stabbed 37 times. Using all of her skills she had learned at the slaughterhouse, she skinned John's body and hung the fleshy suit from a meat hook above the door leading into the lounge. She decapitated him and sliced off some meat from his body and cooked it with vegetables. The dining table had 2 settings, one at each end, with a small note beside each plate. Written there were the names of John's 2 children. She had wished to serve his children the meat from their own father when they returned home. Thankfully, police were able to intervene and arrested Catherine. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole, where she continues to stay today. Elizabeth Bathory, known as the Blood Countess, is a dark memory in Hungarian history. Elizabeth was born into Hungarian nobility in 1560, and even from a very early age watched as her father's officer abused the peasants who lived near the father's estate. When a thief had been captured by her father, his punishment was something Elizabeth would always remember. Elizabeth's father had a dying horse retrieved and its stomach sliced open. The thief was forced inside the horse's gut and was sewn up and left to perish along with the horse. Not only was she exposed to violence at a very early age, but she was also exposed to the fact that her family condoned it, and one powerful lesson stuck in her mind: the life of a peasant was meaningless. As Elizabeth came of age, she was married and had a number of children, but her life was anything but normal. Inside her heart grew an insatiable rage. She lacked empathy for others. She desired blood. That being said, Elizabeth began offering well-paying jobs to the daughters of local peasantry. Excited and eager to make a living their families never could, they would make way for the castle. But what awaited them wasn't a job, but a nightmare. Elizabeth was nobility. She had anything she could possibly ever ask for. However, torture remained in her desires, and she would be sure that she would have it. Elizabeth would trap the young girls as they arrived and inflict immeasurable pain onto them. She would push needles through their lips and under their fingernails. She'd cast them out into the freezing snow naked and douse them with water so they'd freeze to death. Some witnesses claimed she would even strap the girls down and bite the skin off of their faces. The list went on. She would torture these poor girls whenever and wherever she could. Some accounts even claim that she would force some of the girls to cannibalize themselves. A popular legend, though unconfirmed to be true, was that Elizabeth discovered through her numerous sessions of torture that the blood of the young girls resisted her skin from aging, so she would fill up a tub with their blood and bathe in it. Eventually, however, Elizabeth's cravings would have her overstep her bounds. Peasant girls weren't the only ones Elizabeth would order to be taken. In time, she even began abducting the daughters of higher-class citizens. This drew some unwanted attention. In 1610, Elizabeth's castle was raided and she was arrested, along with her accomplices, though due to her nobility, she never saw a trial. Instead, she was locked away in a single room with only slits for air and food, where she remained until her death 4 years later. A popular paraphrasing claims, "Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, but whoever said the woman needed to be scorned, she might just unleash that fury for fun." That's all for now. Remember, you may not believe it, but anything is possible.
At Fabletics, we're known for our leggings because our leggings are cute and designed to perform, and our bras are too. We now have a sports bra for every woman and workout. Shop now and get your 2 pairs of leggings for just $24 only at Fabletics.com.
Stalkers, something to be dreaded by celebrities and non-celebrities alike. Obsessive loners, they won't take no for an answer, and they will come up with ingenious ways of making contact with you, and one thing is for certain, they will indeed make contact with you. Celebrities are loved by a great many people, but sometimes that love turns into a dangerous obsession, and that can lead to disaster. Teresa Saldana was a popular actress in the 1980s. She played a number of different roles, but one in particular led to unexpected results. Her role in the 1980 film Defiance captured the attention of Arthur Richard Jackson, a drifter from Scotland. Jackson became infatuated with Saldana and decided it was time he took a trip to the United States. Jackson proved that he would go to great lengths to find his target. He hired a private investigator to find Saldana's mother's unlisted phone number. He called Teresa's mother, posing as an assistant for director Martin Scorsese. He said he needed Teresa's address to contact her regarding an upcoming role. Her mother gave him the address, and Jackson was on his way. Jackson suffered from a very powerful delusion. He believed it was his destiny to meet with Teresa Saldana and kill her. Once he was captured and executed for her murder, they would both come to reunite in the afterlife, where they would spend eternity together. Jackson located Saldana's address and waited outside. She eventually emerged from the house, and he launched his attack. Arthur Richard Jackson lunged at Teresa Saldana with a large hunting knife and in broad daylight began stabbing her repeatedly. He stabbed her 10 times in her torso, and despite many onlookers, a delivery man on the second floor of a nearby apartment building heard her cries and rushed to her aid. He subdued Jackson, and Teresa was treated at the hospital. After a 4-hour surgery and 4 months in the hospital, she was released. She had survived her brutal encounter. It was revealed that Jackson had stabbed Teresa so hard that he had bent the blade of the knife. Teresa went on to play herself in a role reenacting the experience she had endured, while Jackson earned a trip to a mental hospital where he eventually died of heart failure. Jackson's tactics of hiring a private investigator went on to inspire a new stalker, Robert John Bardo. Rebecca Schaeffer was another actress that would come to know tragedy. At 21 years old, her acting career was starting to take off. She had played in a 1980s sitcom called My Sister Sam and was starting to expand her horizons. She had many admirers, and one of them was 19-year-old Robert John Bardo, who obsessively worshipped Schaeffer and even had a shrine dedicated to her in his home. Bardo had made many attempts to visit Schaeffer on the set of My Sister Sam, but he was always turned away, so he often wrote her letters instead. But something suddenly changed Bardo's perspective when Schaeffer took a role with a male actor and played out a scene where she was in bed with him. Bardo was enraged. He believed Schaeffer had become just another Hollywood whore and decided that she would have to be punished for her misdeeds. With the aid of a private investigator, Bardo obtained Schaeffer's home address and set forth for Los Angeles. Bardo felt betrayed. His delusion was shattered, and he felt he had to remedy the issue as soon as possible. On July 18, 1989, Robert John Bardo approached Rebecca Schaeffer's apartment and rang the bell. She opened the door and he showed her an autograph that she had sent him through the mail some time ago. After a short and awkward conversation, she asked Bardo to leave and not return to her home. Bardo left as requested, but he had no intention of staying away. Bardo went and casually had breakfast at a nearby diner before heading back to Schaeffer's home, but this time he had a brown paper bag with him. Once again, he rang her bell and she again approached the door, answering with what Bardo described as a cold look on her face. He wasted little time before withdrawing a handgun from the bag and shooting Schaeffer in the chest. He fled, and she was pronounced dead shortly after reaching the hospital. Bardo was eventually captured. He was found aimlessly running through traffic. He promptly confessed to the murder and told police that Rebecca Schaeffer's last word was why. Laurie Sho was 16 years old and not a celebrity at all. Unfortunately, she was mixed up in a love triangle between a boy and a jealous ex-lover. Sho was open to the idea of a relationship and in 1991 began to date Lawrence Yunkin. Yunkin's ex-girlfriend Lisa Michelle Lambert was infuriated by this. She still had feelings for him. The relationship between Sho and Yunkin didn't work out, as Sho claimed he had date raped her. Yunkin went back to Lambert, who had turned out to be pregnant with his child. Lisa Lambert and Lawrence Yunkin were once again reunited. True love lasts forever. While Laurie simply wanted to just move on from the entire thing, Lisa wanted to be sure that Laurie would forever regret ever dating her boyfriend. Lisa would often show up at Laurie's job to taunt and verbally assault her. Right in public, she would insult Laurie and express her distaste for her. Witnesses even claimed that they heard Lisa express that she wanted to scare Laurie before hurting her and slitting her throat. Lisa was set on making her desires become a reality. On December 21st, 1991, Hazel Sho, Laurie's mother, received a phone call from Laurie's guidance counselor, who asked Hazel to come down to the school for a short meeting to talk about Laurie. Hazel obliged and left, unaware that the call didn't come from the school at all, but was made by Lisa. Lisa simply wanted to get Laurie's mother out of the house, and she had succeeded. She took a friend and had Lawrence Yunkin drop them off at Laurie's house. Lisa forced her way into Laurie's house and attacked her brutally. She stabbed Laurie repeatedly as she lied helpless on the floor before slitting her throat, just as she had claimed she always wanted to do. Laurie's mother came home a short time after and found her daughter lying in a pool of her own blood, still clinging on to life. As she held her daughter, she claimed that Laurie was able to say a few words, where she revealed to her mother that Lisa was the one who did it. Laurie died shortly thereafter on the floor of her home. Lisa and her friend were both sentenced to life in prison without parole, where they continue to remain. Many students have had a teacher that they find attractive, but for one certain algebra teacher, this harmless attraction turned into obsessive infatuation. Ming-Sen Shiyu was a psychopath. At an early age, his mother described him as violent and uncaring. He lacked empathy or remorse, and throughout his life engaged in criminal activity. While attending high school, Shiyu came to develop a crush on his 9th grade algebra teacher, Mary Stouffer. He sexually fantasized about her, often writing stories where she would be raped. But these kind of activities can't hold a predator at bay forever. A lot of time had passed. It had been 15 years since he sat in Mary Stouffer's classroom, and he had eventually come to discover his old teacher's whereabouts. He stalked Stouffer until May of 1980, where he found her at a salon. She walked out with her 8-year-old daughter Elizabeth, and at gunpoint, he abducted them both. They were quickly tied up and thrown into the trunk of his car, and he promptly headed home. Along the way, however, Mary and her daughter were making a lot of noise. At one point, he had to pull over to keep them quiet. As he was doing this, he was approached by a young boy who had heard the commotion and wanted to see what was going on. Shiyu promptly tossed the boy in the trunk as well. He stopped again along the way to pull the boy out and beat him to death with a metal rod. At his house, the daughter Elizabeth was often locked away in a box, while Mary would spend most of her time locked in his closet unless he was going to take her out, tie her to the furniture, and rape her repeatedly. One day, while Shiyu had been at work, Mary managed to escape the confines of her closet and called the police using Shiyu's phone. Police arrived and rescued her and her daughter almost 2 months after they had been abducted. Having been immediately arrested, Shiyu stood trial and had managed to sneak a knife into the courtroom. While Mary was testifying, Shiyu unexpectedly lunged at Mary and sliced the side of her face open with the knife. It took 62 stitches to close the wound. Shiyu was up for parole in 2010 and for whatever reason was deemed a threat to society even now. So it's been decided that he will spend the rest of his life in prison. Your job is a very good place to meet new people. Even a potential love interest could happen there, but a job is a place that you're required to be at. So it's the perfect place for a stalker. Laura Black was 22 years old when she went to work for ESL Incorporated, a technology firm at the time. There she met Richard Farley. The fact that she was 12 years younger than him did nothing to hold him back. He immediately fell in love with Laura. He often gave her gifts and wrote her letters where he would ask her to be his girlfriend. She always politely declined, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. Over the course of 4 years, Richard would continue to pressure Laura. Even if she changed residences, he would find out where she lived and continue to harass her. Eventually, Laura contacted Human Services of their company, who required Richard to take part in counseling sessions. The sessions didn't help, and Richard continued to press Laura until he was eventually terminated by the company. Overall, he had written Laura over 200 letters. He had been working at ESL Incorporated for 9 years, and now he turned to stalking Laura full-time. Laura filed for a temporary restraining order, and she was granted it, and a court date was set to determine whether the temporary restraining order should become permanent. One day before the court date, Richard drove his motorhome to the ESL parking lot with numerous firearms and over 1,000 rounds of ammunition. He fired on innocent bystanders and killed as many people as he could find that he came across. He killed 7 people and injured 4 others on his rampage. When he came to Laura's office, she attempted to slam the door in his face. He shot through the door twice. The first bullet missed her, while the second struck her in the shoulder. She fell unconscious, and Richard moved on. He failed to kill the one person who he had come to kill before anyone else. Farley held down police SWAT for 5 hours after his rampage. During this time, Laura had awoken, stopped her bleeding, and with some other co-workers managed to escape. He surrendered after requesting a sandwich and soft drink from Togo's. Chances are surprisingly good that you may encounter a stalking situation of your own. According to the National Violence Against Women Survey, 1 in 12 women and 1 in 45 men will experience a stalker in their lifetime. If you feel you may be dealing with a stalker, I've linked some resources in the description below of how to deal with the situation. So I urge you, if you believe you're in this type of situation, to check them out. Also, if you've ever been stalked in your life and you've gotten past it, why don't you share your experience in the comments below? You never know, you might be able to help somebody. That's all for now. Remember, you may not believe it, but anything is possible in a world so seriously strange. I'm Rob Dyke, and I'll see. Urban legends are filled with unsuspecting babysitters falling victim to depraved maniacs. But in the real world, more often than not, it's the strangers watching your kids that you should truly be afraid of. A life primed for opportunity and success can so easily and quickly descend into chaos, sometimes with horrific outcomes, such as the case with 21-year-old David McGreevy, who was set to have a promising military career in England in the 1970s, following in his father's footsteps. However, he was discharged after he started a fire that destroyed one of the rooms at his Navy's base. He was forced to move in with his parents where he couldn't hold a job and was dumped by his fiancée. After the heavy drinking and fits of anger started, David's parents kicked him out, but the man wasn't yet done transforming into the monster. Luckily, Clive and Elsie Ralph, who were friends of David's, offered him shelter in their family home in Worcester, where they lived with their 2 children, Paul and Dawn. Elsie was pregnant with their 3rd child, Samantha, and gave birth not long after David moved in. Over the years, David managed to land a factory job and paid the Ralphs rent weekly and helped cook and watch after the children. Clive, Elsie, and several of the neighbors knew David to love the children as if they were his own, and he often acted as a second father figure to them when Clive was at work. But despite his love for the children, it seems David was never meant to be a parent. It was Friday the 13th in April of 1973 when David stumbled home irritated and drunk to watch the 3 Ralph children for the night. But not long into his babysitting shift, 8-month-old Samantha began crying, and no matter what David did, she just wouldn't stop. Unable to take the crying anymore, he silenced Samantha, who died of a fractured skull. Then Dawn and Paul, visibly upset by their sister's silence, became David's next targets. He slit Dawn's throat with a knife and strangled Paul to death before mutilating their bodies with a pickaxe. Then, for unknown reasons, he took the bodies outside and impaled them on a neighbor's wrought iron fence before fleeing the property. David was later arrested that night and at first denied ties to the crime, but eventually confessed. He pled guilty to all 3 murders on June 28, 1973. After being denied parole 9 times, David was rescheduled to be released into an open prison in 2013, but Elsie believed that he should at least remain behind bars for putting her through 40 years of hell. From what is known, he remains in prison where he is able to cook his own meals and frequents the library. It's becoming less and less likely nowadays that parents will leave their children with a stranger, but sometimes even people you've known for years can't be trusted. Tara Souders, a mother of 3 living in a trailer park in Fort Wayne, Indiana, learned this lesson the hard way back in 2011. Tara was concerned by the 15 sex offenders residing in nearby trailers, and that included Tara's grandfather, James Lamone, who had been charged with child molestation in 2006. But she found trust in neighbor Mike Plumador, who had a criminal record but had no known violence towards children. Eventually, Tara trusted Mike enough to let him watch her 3 children, 9-year-old Aliana and her 2 6-year-old sisters. Mike seemed to take to the girls as a father figure. Allegedly, he even had a Facebook photo album titled The Girls, with pictures of the 3 sisters smiling and enjoying themselves under his care. But social media can sometimes tell the most convincing of lies. On December 22nd, Tara came down with the flu and sent Aliana and her 2 sisters to stay with Mike for a few days. Little did she know it would be a decision she would regret for the rest of her life. Aliana was reported missing on the evening of the 23rd, and Mike was the last person to see her alive. When police questioned him, he spun a story of how he'd gone out that morning to a nearby gas station and purchased a cigar, and upon returning home, he found Aliana was gone. He said that Aliana's two sisters told him that Tara had come by and picked Aliana up and returned to the trailer with her. He didn't see cause for concern until later that evening when he realized Aliana was not with her mother. Search parties were quickly organized but found no trace of the missing 9-year-old. It wasn't until after Christmas, while interrogating Mike, that authorities learned the truth. Mike confessed to beating Aliana to death with a brick the night of the 22nd. After, he stayed up into the early morning hours, dismembering her body with a hacksaw, stowing the head, hands, and feet in his freezer before dumping the rest into garbage bags and disposing of them at a local gas station. Aliana's sisters were thankfully unharmed. Mike never offered a reason for his heinous crime, and his confession shocked the community who'd known him to be a kind man who never said a cross word about anyone. He was found guilty of murder and initially sentenced to death, but the ruling was downgraded to life in prison without the chance for parole in exchange for a guilty plea. When Marina Krim hired 50-year-old Jocelyn Ortega, a kind and seemingly well-qualified nanny, to watch over her 3 children, there was no way she could have known it would all end in violence and bloodshed. Jocelyn Ortega, who was originally from the Dominican Republic, worked for the Krim family for 2 years without incident. The 3 children, 6-year-old Lucia, 3-year-old Nessie, and 2-year-old Leo, all seemed to adore Jocelyn when she was around, and the Krims were pleased with the nanny's work. But in October 2012, things seemed to shift, and an underlying tension between the family and Jocelyn took shape. Then, on October 25th, Jocelyn unexpectedly snapped, and the full force of her anger was realized. She took a knife and began stabbing Lucia, who tried to fight back but unfortunately wasn't strong enough to fend off her attacker. Jocelyn then grabbed a second knife and went after Leo. Marina arrived home that night with her daughter Nessie following swimming lessons and found Lucia and Leo dead in bathwater, overrun with blood. Jocelyn sat next to the tub, bloody knife in hand, and violently stabbed herself in the throat in an attempted suicide. Horrified, Marina called for help, but Jocelyn was the only one who could be saved. Lucia and Leo had bled out before Marina arrived. When Jocelyn was able to speak again, she told officers that her schedule with the Krims had shifted and they'd asked her to clean the house on the 25th, causing her to miss an appointment with her psychiatrist. But the Krims claim they asked Jocelyn to clean in order to help ease her recent financial stress, and that she'd never voiced any kind of dissatisfaction with the request. Jocelyn was visibly upset when viewing the crime scene photos and claimed to have no memory of the attacks. Despite this, she was found fit to stand trial and recently rejected a 30-year prison sentence in exchange for pleading guilty. Her trial is expected to commence this year. Despite their tragic loss, the Krims continue to move forward with their lives. They've since had 2 more sons and have set up the Lulu and Leo Fund in memory of their children. The charity aids childhood educational programs. Christine Falling, a teenager from Florida, was thought to be a victim throughout much of her life. She grew up in a poor household and was often teased for her weight and developmental disabilities, in addition to suffering from epileptic seizures and random aggressive outbursts. But victim turned to villain when she partook in her favorite pastime, dropping cats from deadly heights to see if they really had 9 lives after all, and smothering them with her love to the point where she strangled them. By the time she was 15, she'd been married and divorced to a man 10 years her senior, was a known hypochondriac, and had gained a reputation as a respected and trusted babysitter, despite all of her problems. But beginning when she was 17, Christine had a string of unfortunate circumstances surrounding the children in her care. In 1980, 2-year-old Cassidy Johnson died under her watch from blunt force trauma, which Christine claimed was from the child passing out and falling out of her crib. The death was ruled an accident. Over the next 2 years, 3 more young children simply stopped breathing while Christine was babysitting them, and each time, the autopsy revealed medical issues or viral infections that doctors blamed for the children's deaths. It wasn't until July of 1982 when a 10-week-old infant died while Christine was watching him, and his autopsy revealed internal ruptures consistent with suffocation. When police questioned her, she confessed to smothering 3 of 5 of her victims with a blanket and allegedly claimed that voices in her head chanted relentlessly, commanding her to kill the children. But later she was found to be sane and said there was no apparent reason for the murders. Christine was sentenced to life in prison and was denied parole in 2007, citing behavioral problems in prison and the lack of remorse she felt for her crimes. Neighbors who knew Elżbieta Płakowska, who immigrated from Poland in 2000, knew her as a church-going family woman. She loved her husband Artur and was known to be extremely, almost unnaturally fond of her 2 sons, especially her youngest, Justin, who was only 7 years old. But what neighbors couldn't see was the anger Elżbieta kept hidden beneath the surface, that is, until it boiled to the surface. Then they couldn't ignore it. On Halloween night in 2012, Elżbieta was babysitting her friend's daughter, 5-year-old Olivia Dworkowski, and her son, Justin, at her friend's house. Justin and Olivia knew one another well, as they both attended the same Taekwondo classes, and that night they were playing happily with one another, jumping on the bed and shouting. Suddenly, Elżbieta demanded the children get off the bed and kneel to say their nighttime prayers. As the children prayed, Elżbieta shockingly began to stab her own son with a knife, screaming that he was going to heaven that night. He begged her to stop, told her that he loved her, but it wasn't enough to stop her assault as she turned her attention on a horrified Olivia. She too begged for her life, but by the time it was all over, Justin had been stabbed 100 times and Olivia 50 times, and both of the family dogs had been killed. Realizing what she had done, Elżbieta fled the scene and called her local church, leaving a voicemail confessing that she'd done something awful and needed help. On the other side of town, Olivia's mother arrived home after her shift at the hospital to find her house locked up and Elżbieta's car gone. When police arrived, they forced their way in and found what they described as the most gruesome crime scene they'd ever witnessed. It didn't take long for authorities to track Elżbieta down and arrest her. While in questioning, the Poland native changed her story several times, first claiming that someone broke in and murdered the children, then saying that she'd been trying to force the devil out of them by stabbing them. Eventually, the truth came out, however. Elżbieta was unhappy with her marriage to Artur, who was a full-time truck driver. She was furious he was always on the road, forcing her to take care of Justin and take up housekeeping and babysitting jobs, which she thought were beneath her. In revenge, she killed her son in hopes of hurting Artur the way she felt that she'd been hurt. Olivia was killed because she was a witness to Justin's murder. Strangely enough, Artur claimed that he was under the assumption that the marriage was fine. They'd exchanged I love yous a day before the senseless killings, and he never knew Elżbieta to be anything but happy with him. She pled not guilty and will likely stand trial this year. That's all for now. Thank you for watching. Be sure to leave a like on this video if it makes you look at babysitters even a little bit differently. And of course, don't miss my last episode of Twisted Tens on the 10 most haunted buildings in the world. Or if you need something to lighten you up a bit, you can watch my newest episode of my comedy series, Why Would You Put That on the Internet? You can watch either one by clicking on screen or below this video. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, you probably should right now, because you won't want to miss what's next. And I'll see you next Wednesday. Love can make you do crazy things, but some people are just naturally that way. Rainbot joins me for this special Valentine's edition of Twisted Tens.
In May of 2008, Ricardo Marias broke things off with his girlfriend of 4 years, Tatiana Bastos, and moved on within weeks. Tatiana was less than thrilled to learn Ricardo already had a new girlfriend, so she began to stalk him. Tatiana ambushed Ricardo at work, demanding to know why he was ignoring her text messages. Feeling sorry for Tatiana, Ricardo offered to take her back to her apartment. The moment they got into the car, she began making sexual advances on Ricardo, which he rejected. Tatiana then snapped and pulled out a 6-inch kitchen knife from her purse and stabbed Ricardo's penis. In blinding pain, he stopped the car and managed to seek refuge with a passing motorist, who drove him to the hospital where he was stitched up and eventually recovered. Tatiana was ultimately charged with grievous bodily harm and handed a 32-month prison sentence for actions the judge has labeled as truly wicked.
18-year-old Ashley Doolittle seemed to have it all. She graduated from a high school in Berthoud, Colorado, and was enrolled at Colorado State University for the fall. A champion horse rider, those around Ashley admired her hard work ethic and her infectious smile, including her 18-year-old boyfriend, Tanner Flores. But after 1 year of dating, Ashley ended things with Tanner, who was devastated and confused by the sudden breakup. Tanner sent alarming Snapchats to friends hinting he was suicidal, even weeks after the breakup. Then, on June 9, 2016, Ashley's car was found abandoned on the side of the road. At the same time, Tanner's father realized both his .22 caliber gun and his son were missing. Tanner had stolen the firearm and confronted Ashley, shooting her twice in the head. He then cleaned the body and shoved it into the back of his truck before driving 5 hours away to his grandfather's ranch in Colbrand, Colorado.